Hi, welcome to a new SimplyMaya tutorial. In this tutorial I wanted to take some time to cover some basic cloth elements that are very common to archviz. So you can think of this tutorial as a shortcut for things that you would normally see in an interior scene. So here we've got some rather nice cloth on these chairs. We've got this duvet, which is actually a fairly complex cloth object, this headboard, which is also a cloth object, and these curtains here. Now I'm going to take you through the creation of these one by one. It's actually a slight divergence for us because we've done something similar in the past with end cloth. At this point I'm going to use a piece of software called Marvelous Designer. It's on version 3 at the moment, but you'll be able to follow along with an older version. Also I'm going to be using Maya for exporting and importing objects, but feel free to use Max or whatever other 3D software that you're using. I'm going to be doing everything as OBJs, so pretty much you'll be able to follow this with any 3D piece of software. Now if you haven't seen Marvelous Designer before, it looks like this when you open it, and we'll go through the interface in a moment. It's predominantly been used on quite a few new movies, The Hobbit, some other stuff for clothing, but you can also use it as a great package for, you know, things, as I said, commonly found in archviz. Curtains, as you can see, we've got these quite complicated draperies here consisting of different parts, some complicated chair fabrics, some cushions, and this sort of thing. Now the nice thing with Marvelous Designer, although it's quite expensive to buy outright, you can actually, if you just go to their website, which is marvelousdesigner.com, you can actually just rent it monthly. So this keeps the cost down, and if you're doing a lot of archviz, you can just rent it for a couple of months, build up all an object library for yourself, curtains, bedspreads, sheets, things like that. It'll go into great detail and it's quite fast. So if you see here, we'll be looking at creating this fitted sheet as well, which I forgot to mention. In this case it's not necessary because we've got the duvet on top, but in your own scenes you may need it, so I'll cover that as well. Now the first thing I want to start with is curtains. So if we hide the more fancy drapery up here, which I'm just going to Control H in Maya, you'll see we've got these standard basic sort of hanging curtains. Now you can do this with end cloth in Maya. There's some other simulation programs you could use for Max as well, but I'm going to show you in Marvelous Designer. This is really quick and really simple. So we're going to need a sense of scale. So if I look in my preferences, sorry, not performance settings, you'll see that I'm currently working in centimeters, and I'm currently working to a pretty true real world value. Now this is essential for Marvelous Designer. If this bed were 1 meter by 1 meter 80, sort of 2 meters by 1 meter 80, which it is at the moment, a real world size, then the cloth we simulate for it is going to be pretty real. If it was however 1.8 centimeters by 1 centimeter, it would look fine in the model, but when we come into Marvelous Designer it needs things to be at a real world scale. So in order for us to check that, what I'm going to do is just throw in a cube and make it 1 meter square. Now I'll just find this cube. Whoops. There we go. And what I'm going to just move this sort of into our room, and now I'm going to export this for Marvelous Designer, and when we import it we can use it to make sure that we are working at the correct scale. So I just go File, Export Selection, and I'm going to export this into my data directory, and I'm going to export it as an OBJ. So as I said, we'll be using OBJs, so the 3D package you're using should support pretty much everything. So I'm just going to call this Scale Test. Now if you're in Maya and you don't see an option for exporting OBJ, you may need to go to the plugin manager, scroll down until you find OBJ export and give it a tick. By default it's not loaded. Mine's set to auto load because I export OBJs a fair bit. So now we bring up Marvelous Designer, and the interface is quite simple. this is your perspective view, and for users of Maya this will be quite familiar because it's the same. So it's alt and left click to rotate around, middle to pan, and right click to zoom in and out. If you're on a different piece of software, you can actually go to the settings, preferences, and under view control you'll see I have mine as Maya preset. So they have max and a couple of other things, or you can set your own to whatever you're comfortable with, but for now I'm going to use mine as Maya, so all the controls in Maya's perspective view will work here. Okay, and this dummy, which has the cloth on it at the moment, is called an avatar in Marvelous Designer, and obviously our avatar is going to be whatever we put cloth on. So we're not going to be using one of these, we're going to be importing our own OBJs. So let's just close the avatar editor window and go to File, Import, and even though it's not under the avatar menu, this will actually import what they call an avatar. So I'll import my scale test object, and you'll see that I want my scale set in centimeters because that's what my scene scale is set in. So when I click OK now, you can see we still have the previous garment. So if we just go File, New Garment, I don't want to save it, that will just clear the file away. Now in our perspective view we can now see we've brought in our avatar, so if we were to start putting cloth in this now, this would be interactive, and in our side view here we can see this is the box that's been brought in. This is the floor plane in Marvelous Designer. Now cloth will collide with this by default, just so you know. So if you bring in your model from Maya and let's say it was below the actual floor plane, or in Max, doesn't matter, and then you import it into Marvelous Designer, you're not going to be able to allow cloth to pass through this floor plane. So it's a good idea to place the model in your scene where you want to actually put the cloth. So for instance, later on when we come to the bed, we'll actually have the mattress here where we want it in the scene before we start to make the fitted sheet. But for right now, our scale test, so we know this is 1 meter, 1 meter, 1 meter. So if we look in the toolbar here, top of Marvelous Designer, you'll see Create Polygon, Create Rectangle. For now we just want to create a quick rectangle, whoops, and just press and drag, and there we go. Now that's opened up, we've got a line length of almost 4 meters. It's not quite spot on in the corners, but it's close enough to tell us that Marvelous Designer thinks these 4 lines together are 4 meters, which is exactly what they should be. So now we know we have our scale between Maya and Marvelous Designer set correctly. That import that you saw when it asked you to pick centimeters, millimeters, that doesn't always work for every 3D application, hence the scale test. I believe in 3D Studio Max you might need to set that to millimeters. So just play around, but make sure you just do a quick measure test so you're always getting the right scale, because if you're not, your cloth is just not going to look right, because Marvelous Designer does actually need accurate to scale models to work with. So if we just clear away our garment now, which is what this is, we design our garments in this side view and then transport them over to this perspective view for simulation, but I'll just clean that away. So new garment, no, and you'll see it disappears from here. So the first thing I want to talk to you about, and I'll separate this tutorial into a series of videos. One will deal with curtains, one with bedspreads, one with chair cloth, one with cushions, etc. But for right now we'll just take a look at how to make these curtains. They're probably the simplest object we'll create in Marvelous Designer. So we could just open up Marvelous Designer, draw a couple of squares and turn them into curtains, but because we'll need a object to let us know the scale in Maya, because we'll want to export these back in and have them placed in the scene. So I'll just hide my curtains, and what I'll do is I'll make a kind of temporary curtain rail just so I've got a proxy object to work with in Marvelous Designer. Whoops. So I just find where that thing has gone. There we go. Now I'm not actually going to have the curtains interact with this curtain rail at the moment. Later on in another tutorial we'll be looking at how to get Marvelous Designer to interact with our 3D objects, but for right now this one will just be there to give us a sort of sense of the size of this window. So let's move that out. And this is going to be the simplest way as well that we can create these curtains in Marvelous Designer. Later on we'll take a look at some more sort of advanced kind of drapery. So we'll get away from your standard sort of IKEA curtains. Okay, so as you can see I'm just getting this sort of where my curtains are going to drape, and you can move into the view and do this a little more accurately, but for me this will be fine. So there we go, one sort of temporary curtain rail just to give us some positioning information. As I said, this would be the simplest set of curtains that we did. So now just let's export this selection, and I'm just going to call this C rail. Okay, so into Marvelous Designer, and I'm going to show you now just how quick and how simple this is, say in comparison to something like Encloth. So first thing we'll do is we'll import this OBJ as our curtain rail, as our avatar, sorry, and we know we want the centimeters. Okay, so if I take a look, I can find it now in this view here. So now we want two curtains, but in this particular exercise I want them closed. So what I'm going to do is just draw my first curtain approximately where it should be, and this is where really having this proxy object here really helps, because I know if I'm looking at my own curtains at home, they're just slightly wider than the window and they drape on the floor a little bit. So now we've drawn this sort of rectangular curtain block, we need to synchronize it over into this display. So there's a button here that will say sync. Okay, and now you can see that my curtain is in the perspective view here. It's not in the right position, and I will say that Marvelous Designer can be a bit tricky compared to other 3D apps. As you can see, wherever I click, that's where my movement guy comes, and it's just not exceptionally good. So one of the first things you're going to want to do is set the gizmo, which is what they call their axis here. You're going to want to set the gizmo to local coordinates, and that will at least keep it straight. It's still not going to be as intuitive as probably what you're used to working with. So let's go ahead and move this into position. But you'll notice it goes through the floor slightly. So if I simulate this now, what will happen is everything under this floor plane will just be ignored, so it will be chopped off, and let me just show you that happening. So I'm going to hit simulate, and you see it jumped upwards. And you know, as cloth simulators go, this one's pretty quick. It's all CPU based, so unfortunately there's no GPU acceleration yet, but it's still pretty quick. So obviously that's not making much of a curtain. I just wanted to show you that everything under this line will be cut. So I can now reset my pattern to its default arrangement. Okay, and it'll appear back over there, which it does sometimes, which can be quite a pain. As I said, Marvelous Designer is perhaps not quite as smooth as some of the more polished 3D applications, but it is very good at what it does. So because I don't want this ground piece to be cut off, I can come here and just push this way. But we'll still have that problem of when I simulate this now, it's just going to fall on the floor. There's a couple of ways I can hold it up in the air. One of the simplest is to quite simply draw another rectangle of cloth, like so. Okay, and one of the nice things about Marvelous Designer, because it was created in the same way that tailors use cloth patterns, I can just keep drawing patches of cloth, and I can actually stitch them together with these sewing machine icons here. And you'll notice also that their gizmo always comes in locally now, so it can still be a bit of a pain, but it is better than what it comes in at default. So I'm just going to arrange this so it's kind of where it is in this picture, almost. Okay, now if I right click on this in the viewport, you'll see a freeze. When I hit that, it'll turn blue. Now freeze means this cloth won't move. So if I was to attach these two pieces of cloth together, this one will fall towards the floor as you would expect, or as much as it can do being attached to this one will just be frozen in place. So if I take a look on our side view again, and I just use the segment sewing tool, you can see I can stitch this one by just clicking and then coming up here and clicking, and you'll see in our view that there's these stitch marks. So when I hit simulate now, these two things will be stitched together. And if we take a look at our scene at the moment, you can see, let me just close some of this so it's a little simpler, but I've got my pattern 2190, which will be my big cloth here, and then my pattern. So one of the things you might want to do is rename these. So I'm going to name this curtain 1, and I'll name this one curtain rod 1. And you don't have to do this, but you can end up with quite a few pieces of cloth, so it's just nice to keep a, you know, a good naming convention going, that one that you understand. And the seam line, which is this line here. So if I just hit simulate now, you should see kind of what you expect to see, which is this fall down and become more curtain-like. Okay, you can see the frozen piece is just sitting up there in the air, and this one, you can see where we've got it in this view. So it drapes along the floor, you can see that drapery there. Now the nice thing about Marvelous Designer is we come up here, and I'm going to select this transform pattern and just make it longer. So you can see I can interact with this even after it's simulated. So if your pattern's a bit too long or a bit too short, don't panic, you don't have to resimulate all the time with Marvelous Designer. Okay, so let's put mine back, and it's gonna have a bit of a wobble now because I've changed it, but if I just leave it for a few seconds to simulate, it should all ease out. Now another thing you should know is simulation resolution within Marvelous Designer is defined by this pixel particle distance. So the lower that is, the more complex your simulation will get, so the more particles it will use to actually determine things like folds in cloth. It'll also get much slower. If you decrease that sort of to say 5, you'll see my simulation will now take a long time to resync over, and it will take also quite a long time to simulate. So whereas before you could actually see this happening almost, or not quite in real time, but it was fast enough for us to just watch, now it's very slow. So we'll cover some of the tricks for particle distance, so you can speed up doing the simulations and then get a more high-res look afterwards, because I would recommend my normal technique is to start with a particle distance of about 40, and then when the main simulation is done, I'll reduce this, and that will give me a higher resolution look at the end. So I just hit rearrange all patterns there, and that puts us back to the start of our simulation. So with a particle distance of 40, you'll see this is now extremely quick. But you're probably thinking to yourself at this point, there's not much looking like a curtain, so we need to fold this together. Now, a really quick and simple way to do this is to take this and make sure you're on transform pattern and just make it smaller. So if we zoom in now, you should be able to see how that's affected our seam line. At least we could if I move this one a bit. And just to exaggerate it, you can see now that all of this is going to be pulled this way. So push this up and reset the pattern and simulate again, and you can see we start to get some folds in our curtain. But because of the particle distance being quite high, it's not that high res. But again, with Marvelous Designer, not much of a problem. We could calculate the particle distance a bit lower, let it simulate out, and you can see that the folds here get a lot smoother and we get more detail in our cloth. So once again, take this, maybe I want my curtain to bunch up even more. Okay, and you can see, compared to a lot of other simulation methods a la N-cloth, this is really quick and really quite intuitive. I can even just grab this while it's still simulating. Okay, another thing you can do in Marvelous Designer, and this will depend on the speed of your machine. So if you're using an older, slower machine, I'll show you a few other techniques to do this. If you're on quite a nippy machine, an i7, then you can just grab the bottom edge of the curtain or wherever you want and actually pull it around in real time while it's still simulating. So this really allows you to get in there and tweak where your cloth is going. So I can grab this edge and pull this out, and this one maybe. So I have a lot of control here on how this cloth works, and the software is actually fast enough to allow me to do this as it simulates. Okay, so really quick, really simple way to make just your standard sort of draped curtain. When we come back, I'll show you how to do the much more complicated, well, in Marvelous Designer it's actually not that more complicated, but much more complicated looking, you know, style drapery where you've got those cleats that come in the middle and then two sets of curtains. But that's basically Marvelous Designer. So we've taken two patterns here, we've stitched them together, we've made one smaller, and just so we know we're on scale, what I'll actually do is stop that simulating and I'll just transfer this back over to Maya. So I'm going to export OBJ, and let's just call this curtain for Maya. Okay, now you can export as a single object or multiple object. I don't want the avatar shape. I don't want this curtain rod to be exported back into Maya, so I'm going to untick it. I want to make sure that I'm on the same scale that I brought it in it, so in this case centimeters. I want the two patterns, and in this case I actually don't want the two patterns because I don't want the curtain rod holder. I'm not going to be using that in Maya, so I can untick that, and everything else looks about fine. So I'm just going to click OK, and that should have exported. We will import into Maya, and I'm going to need to flick this to OBJ, and here's our curtain for Maya OBJ, and as you can see it comes in there in exactly the right place where we expected it. So I just need to center its pivot. I'll pull it out a bit so we can get a better look at it, but you can see there is my curtain dragging nicely on the floor, and there it is in the room. Now it's still a little low res looking, but we'll take care of that in the next part. So thanks for watching this, and we will get on with something a bit more complicated after the break. Cheers. Hi, welcome back. So in the last part we created our rather simple curtain here, which as you've seen in Marvelous Designer is a very quick process. Now I'm going to expand upon this and do the more fancy curtain that you saw that I had demonstrated in the first part. So I'm just going to pop open Marvelous Designer, and one of the first things I notice about this curtain is that it doesn't really have enough folds in it for me. I want this to look like much more fabric than this. So if I just reset its pattern, I can come here making sure that I'm on this transform pattern and just make this a lot bigger. So when it folds back up, it'll have a lot more wrinkles. So if I set the particle distance to 40 just to do the initial simulation, it'll be nice and quick, as you can see. And there we go. Now you can see it's a little jaggedy. This is because of the particle distance being so high. So before we get to work on the other half of the curtain, I just want to dump that down to 20 and just let it simulate out for a few seconds, and you can see that gets nicer, gets some more detailing in here, and the whole thing gets smoother. So when you're happy with the look of your curtain, what we can do now is we can create the other side. Now I've seen a lot of archviz where one curtain has been made in end cloth and then just duplicated and pulled around in the 3D program, and if you want to export this and just do that, that's fine, but I want to give mine a more realistic look, so that means simulating both sides of the curtain for me. Now I can copy and paste these, or I can just create new ones, and these are not particularly complicated patterns. I shall just go ahead and create new ones. This will add to a kind of more random look. And obviously I want to get both curtains the same length. So again, I'll need to move these about in the foreview, get them in approximately the same place as the last ones. As I said, this perspective view in Marvelous Designer is not fantastic. And when I simulate out this second curtain, obviously I don't want this one to keep simulating as well, otherwise we'll be here for a month of Sundays. So I'm just going to select this, go up here and hit freeze, and that will freeze this curtain into place. So, you know, this is exactly as we did with the first curtain. I'm just going to tilt it a little bit so we don't catch it on the floor. I might need to tilt it a little bit more. That should do it. I'll need to freeze this as it won't be moving, and then I'll need to stitch this to this. So once again, just use the segment sewing. Okay, and let's make sure these are not crossed over. Okay, I think what we've got there is a bit of a problem, so I'm just going to undo that sewing, and I'm going to move these. It doesn't really matter where they are here. You'll see I move them here and they don't actually move in the perspective view. It just allows me to get a better view when I do this. And there we go. I can just double check that. I can come in here and move this out a little bit to make sure it's good, and it's good. Just recheck the positioning, it looks fine. So by default Marvelous Designer 3 opens up the particle distance of 20. Once again I'm going to set it to 40 for the initial simulation, and that should just drape over nicely. And now instead of having the same drape curtain mirrored across, we'll get two different looking ones with different bunches on the floor. Just add slight sense of realism in there when you go to render later on. And again, it's got a particle distance of 40, so I'm going to nip that down to 20 and just re-simulate a bit. and you see it smooths out like the other one did. Now at the moment, fabric on these curtains is kind of Marvelous Designer's default fabric. So if you want a more, you know, wrinkly look, or something that would give you more like cotton or more like denim or leather, you can go into fabric, and we have here assigned to this, you'll see it's all highlighted in red when we click it, the basic fabric, and we can then set a preset chiffon, cotton, wool, denim, you know, whatever you'd like. So when we come to finalize this, we'll increase the resolution a bit. We may play around with the basic fabric settings to get a slightly different look. So there we have now 2 curtains. So, you know, in a lot of cases that would be all you need for your window, but let's do a fancy sort of pleated bit in the middle here. So in order to do that, and I'm just going to select all of this, I'm just going to move it out of the way. I'm going to freeze this so we don't simulate it as we simulate the next part, and I'm going to line up my proxy object and get it ready for our nice middle part here. So once again, polygon, and click and drag, and I'm going to give it plenty of fabric because it's going to this time it's not going to be pulled across, it's going to be pulled upwards. So let's just move this into position. Okay, and we're going to need to hold it in position here. I can see it's bisecting a little bit, we don't actually want that. So to hold it in position, I'm just going to create another one. And I'm going to use the transform just to make sure it's the right size. There we go. I mean, the nice thing about this process is, compared to a lot of other cloth simulators you might have tried, whether natively built into your 3D software or not, it's extremely fast to put these kind of things together. So let's just now go to our segment sewing, and sew this one to this one. Okay, now when we hit go, that would just fall straight to the floor, of course, because this is not frozen. So let's just freeze that. Okay, and as you can see, this just hanging about, doing not a lot at all really. So our trick that we did before, which was just shrinking this, won't work because we need it to go upwards. So we need a slightly different trick in our bag of tricks now. So before I do anything, I'm going to just reset the pattern and make sure the particle distance is on 40 so I don't spend a lot of time simulating over and over again. And what I need is to pull this middle part of the fabric upwards. So I can do this with an internal line. So create internal polygon line, and I'll find approximately halfway. Click once, go upwards, and double click to finish my line. So you'll now see we have this line in here, and if I simulate, you'll see we get it. I don't know if you'll be able to see it in the viewport quite yet, but we'll get this, you can actually see the line, you can't see a fold in the fabric. If I were to, say, increase the fold angle and the fold strength, you should see, yeah, there you go, a fold line within the fabric. Now, this is not what we want for this, I just wanted to show you as we'll be using it later. So let's turn the fold rendering off. And if I reset the pattern with the fold rendering off, you shouldn't. Let's just set the fold strength down to 0 so we don't actually see the fold. What we want is the elasticity. So we'll turn the elasticity on, and you'll see here that we get, and these lines are referred to as 2D shaped lines. If you want to find them in your scene, it will be under root 2D shape. You can go ahead and rename those if you want. So we'll turn the elastic on. Now first thing we'll do is turn the elastic strength up a little bit, and this will be an elastic ratio of 80. So this will pull up to be 20% shorter than this, and if I hit simulate now, you'll see what I mean. So you can see this is quite a nice way for us to start pulling this fabric up into shape. So we're going to need quite a bit more strength than that, and we're going to need a much smaller ratio. So let's go to 25%. Okay, so that's really starting to pull up and bunch up our fabric now. But one line in and of itself is not going to be able to do this, and also these corners need to be pulled up as well. So let's create a few more of these polygonal lines and see if we can wallop this into shape. So I'm going to put a few side by side here. And you can hold shift to get a straight line. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same here. So the reason I'm using multiple lines is, rather than just have one line that has this incredible pulling power, it looks much more natural if you would look at a curtain tie or something to have this wider line. So, or at least this has been the technique that's been successful for me in the past. And you know, for a finished product, I would obviously spend quite a bit more time lining these up and making sure they're all perfect, but for this, you know, it'll be good enough for demonstration purposes. So now all of these 2D shapes are my elastic curtain lines. So I'm going to look at the settings I had for that first one, and I'm going to just change these all to be the same, which I can do by simply doing this, and you'll see these have all changed values. So you can multi-select, and then let's get a strength of say 50, a ratio of 25, and you'll see what's happened. These are not now orange, because orange is telling me that one of these or multiple ones of these have different values. If I click this and then click it off, you should see that they're now all off on the fold rendering, and if I select them all again, it's no longer orange. Okay, so let's just hit go and see what we get. And it will take a while to sim out properly. Okay, we don't have enough resolution in here yet, but you can see we're starting to get this very nice fold effect. We need some more drapery to come down in here, but for right now I can stop the simulation. Just, whoops, don't want a polygonal line. Just click our pattern here and just add a little more resolution to it. So let's go from 40 to 20. Okay, and that starts to give us a little more resolution. Now let's grab this off, and let's grab the first 3 lines we created, which were the ones in the middle, and let's lower the ratio a little bit so this goes up a little bit more. And this will be a bit violent to start with, but if you just give it a second, it should calm down and you should start to get a much nicer, more pleasing shape to it. And obviously you can keep lowering this particle distance. If we take a look at our pattern, the particle distance is at 20. I go as low as 10 sometimes. It depends, you know, how close you're going to get to this in your 3D shot. From sort of over here, looks fine. If you were going to get into sort of, you know, massively up close territory, then you might want this to be a little higher in its resolution. so in that case tweak the particle distance. But I'm going to add the little pleats that come down here in the next part, and also because this is quite ugly, we'll add another little bit of fabric that comes down just to cover this up, which is actually what they seem to do with the real version of these curtains. So I shall be back in the next part. We'll cover some more of these drapes, get them back into Maya, and I'll show you some little things you can do once they're in the 3D package to help, you know, with some of this geometry which maybe wouldn't be quite as smooth as you want it. So thanks for watching this part. I will see you in the next part. Okay, welcome back. We kind of left off here, and it's already a pretty impressive piece of drapery. Now you could just stop here if you wanted to, but as this piece of software is quite easy to work with, we can add some finishing touches. We can add some extra drapery down here to really make kind of a magnificent window dressing, rather than just what you would normally see in a lot of archviz, which is just a simple folded cloth pleated thing like this. Let's just make this a little more complicated. So I'm going to drape some more fabric down here, and how I'm going to do that, again, I'm just going to pick the rectangle. First we'll freeze this, and I'm going to pick the rectangle again, and I'm just going to draw. And again, your mileage may vary, your size may vary depending on scene, but for me, I'm going to resync that up so my cloth appears in the scene, and I'm just going to stitch this edge to this edge, so that will stitch this to this, and actually that will then drape down quite nicely. So once again, our segment sewing tool, and let's make sure we stitch it in the right place. Okay, I'm going to move this closer so the simulation doesn't have to do quite so much work. And when I hit simulate, you'll see this drapes up and then down quite nicely. And I can see that it's really quite high resolution. So obviously I've forgotten to change the particle distance, which I'll do now, and then that should be really quite a bit quicker, which it is. So you'll notice that this will actually interact with our already frozen curtain here. And one of the nice things about Marvelous Designer is that all of this stuff will come in UV mapped. So I could then apply a patterned fabric to the front and a white fabric to the back, giving my, you know, drapery a much more impressive look. So let's just kill the simulation on that. And as you can see, it's nicely interacted with the curtain behind it. It's looking a bit low res, but again, our normal trick, and just simulate out a few seconds. Let it redrape. And the properties of this cloth are controlled by the fabric that you use. So as I said, we're using the kind of the default fabric at the moment. We'll look at using another type of fabric when we create the bedspread or one of the chairs. But for now, this default fabric is kind of perfect for curtains. So if it ain't broke, as they say. So now we've got some kind of magnificent drapery here. Let's just freeze this one. Okay, and do the same on the other side. So I want to get it about the same size. Let's just move this out the way. And again, one of the reasons I don't like to copy and paste so much is I feel it looks a little more organic and a little more detailed if the sizes are ever so slightly off. So, you know, if it's all identical, then you can get the case of it all simulates the same way. If it's a couple of mil out, then this can look a little more natural. So I'm just going to do this by eye, but please feel free to be a little more precise than me, and it's click and drag. So that looks around the same to me. and again just move this roughly into position. You don't have to be too careful. It's just so the sim doesn't have to do too much work, sort of dragging it 4 meters across the scene. And once again, segment sewing. And let's just check that there's no crossed. No, it looks absolutely fine. So let's just click and make sure we're on a value of 40 and simulate. And again, because the particle distance, this will be pretty quick. Whoops, and we've had a small accident there where this one has sort of bumped into the back curtain. I'm not actually sure that's a bad thing though. It gives us this sort of more organic look. You can see that these two separate pieces of fabric are actually interacting. So I'm just going to stop that sim at 40, sorry, change it to 20. And let that sim out a few scenes so we get a higher resolution cloth. What we can do if we want to give a bit more natural weight to this whole thing is unfreeze it all now and do a simulation with every piece of cloth set to a particle distance of 20, maybe even 15 if you want to get that extra res in there. What I'm going to do first is just create a little bit of fabric to cover up this nasty elastic line here. So let's just freeze that and find the proxy object on our view, which is not the best in the world because obviously it's grey. So I'll just use this as a guide. And this time I'm gonna do something slightly different. Rather than using the rectangle, I'm going to use just to create polygon. And I'm going to create sort of a more decorative tab. You know, and these are all little finishing touches which you can add or not. It would depend on your scene and exactly what sort of drapery you're trying to create. To be brutally honest, all I'm doing here is creating the most complicated sort of curtain pattern that I can think of. So it'll give you guys some ideas. Because I can assure you the curtains in my house do not look like this. A little bit more simple, but so we're going to need something for this to grab onto, and to make it interesting I'm going to make it a bit smaller than the width of this so we get a few folds in it. Okay, that should do it. Now we need to move it into position. Again, this marvelous designer thing here is not brilliant, but you can work with it, which is all that really matters at the moment. Okay, so this is one final piece of drapery. It just needs stitching together again. And you'll notice that you've got this little line here. This shows you it's going to stitch straight. If you move the cursor over, you can see it's got a cross in it. This will actually stitch it crosswise, which we don't want for this. Which is why I always go ahead and check here to make sure these are not crossing over each other. Okay, so we'll need to freeze this little guy. And this one, in fact in this case we can just leave that at 20. It's such a small piece of cloth, it should be quite quick anyway. Okay, well, it didn't really fold up as much as I would have liked, so let's tweak it a little bit. We're going to need to transform, of course. Let's make this a little smaller. And this I'm going to make a little wider. Just reset the pattern. Just want to make sure it's not bisecting into the curtain. And what I can do is move this one backwards. And what that will do is pull this backwards a little bit so it kind of interacts with this cloth here. So you can see now it's sort of lying on this cloth here. That probably is a little too big for this style of window display, but I mean that's something we can come back in and tweak later. You can obviously just make it a little smaller. It's not really such a big thing to do. So you just need to tweak that until it's about the size that you feel is appropriate. Oops. And in this case I want to reset it. And again, these small tweaks can take some time just to get a size that you're happy with. And you'll notice it takes a while to drape, and because the particle distance, but also because it's going to interact with all the stuff behind it. Okay, and just give that a few seconds. Okay, I'm going to stop that, just zoom out so we can see where we're at, and that looks absolutely perfect to me. It's just a little piece of fabric to cover up those stretch lines. I mean, obviously you can omit that if you want to. So now I'm pretty happy with this curtain, so I could just stick it straight into Maya, and I say if you want to get a bit more resolution in there, you can just go around and unfreeze all this. I'm just going to save first. So what you're actually saving is the garment. I'm going to call this curtain tutorial 01. I've already got one save, but again, this is the garment, this is the avatar in our case, the original window bar that we bought in. Okay, so again, if you wanted more resolution, you can come in and unfreeze. And if I was to unfreeze this and this, now these will all simulate together. So let's just sim them out together and see what happens first. And this might take quite a while, but you can see now this is interacting with the pull from these. And we'll give it a minute to settle down. So now you should start to see this pull down a bit more with the weight of all this fabric, so you might have to go in and redo the elasticity. Now you can skip this step, or you can simply simulate these out one at a time again if you wanted more resolution, but I like to sometimes come in and just give it a chance to kind of settle down all as one piece. So give it a couple of minutes maybe. And I'll actually just pause the video here and I'll see you in a second after I've let this settle down. Okay, so that's settled down, and as you can see this is kind of pulled downwards a little bit more. I think it just looks a little more natural. Again, feel free to skip that step. So what we want to do, and again I left it at a resolution of 20, a particle distance of 20. If you go any higher than that, you will get slightly nicer creases, but it will bring a lot of polygons into your 3D app. So unless I'm doing real up close work, or it's a really small piece of fabric, then I try to stay within a particle distance of about 20. Simply for the number of polygons. You'll go into the tens of millions of polygons if you start to get lower than this. So, right, so let's export this whole thing over to Maya. or indeed as it's an OBJ you can bring it wherever you want to really. And let's go curtain for Maya full. Okay, so what we don't want, and this is again why we should have named some of these patterns, is we don't want these placeholders across the top. Now, as I didn't name my patterns, I'm going to export these as multiple objects. So each individual pattern will come into Maya as one object. So let's just make sure we're on the right scale, which is in our case is centimeters. We know we don't want the avatar shape, so let's untick that. We'll just hit go. And that exported. So let's pull open Maya and import it. First, actually, I think I'll delete this old import that we had. Okay, and curtain for Maya full. And there we go. So let's just hide this bed. And we get a better look at our magnificent curtains. So you can see we've got a little bit of intersection going on, but you know, nothing too serious. In fact, it's just the camera angle. We have no intersection, which is marvelous. And we do have all of this fabric to work with. So you know, that's a fairly magnificent piece of drapery there, and I'll just put a different material on it so we can get a better look. Okay, so we got this fairly magnificent piece of drapery here created pretty quickly, really, in comparison to the length of time it normally takes. Now, as I said, this has come in with all its UVs. So if you want to put pattern fabric on this, it's really quite a simple procedure. So you might do these back curtains as like a nice light white chiffon, and the front curtains as sort of a dark velvet. That's up to you. But there is one pretty decent piece of drapery. Now, if we start to look at this up close and personal, you can see it's really not that high a res. So if you start to get some pinching or folding, now in Maya, how I deal with this is I'll just go to Mesh and the Sculpt Geometry tool, and then I'll double click here to bring open its tool settings, and I'll just use some smoothing. So I'll get the radius about the size I want it, this is okay, and the max displacement about the size I want it, and then I can come in and just gently smooth out any kind of rough areas. Now, most of the time this is not actually necessary, but if you do notice that you've got kind of a jaggedy edge that you're not satisfied with, it is pretty simple to come in now and just start to tweak away, you know, with your Sculpt Geometry tool to get the exact look that you're after. And as you can see, as we export it as multiple objects, that's what these have come through as. Now you can, if you want to, of course, export as one object also. I tend to just bung them out as multiples. It saves some time, so I probably group these two because they'll have the same shader, and then I'll just go along and group these. So in the next part we'll take a look at creating the material on these chairs, which is slightly different than the curtains that you've seen. So we'll take a look at how to take a basic proxy object or avatar, if you like, for Marvelous Designer and make these chairs. Okay, so I hope you found something useful in that, and I hope you'll now breeze through any sort of drapery or curtains you need to do for your archviz, and I will see you in the next part. Thanks very much for watching. Hi, welcome back. In the last part we ended up with this curtain, and you might notice mine has a little more resolution to it. All I've done is just lowered the particle distance. I simply did this because after a quick test render in Maya, I'll just bring up my render view here, it looked a little chunky to me, and I didn't want to go to the bother of smoothing it out with the Sculpt Poly tool. So I just went back into Marvelous Designer and gave it a little more resolution by decreasing the particle distance. I mean, that will depend on your scene. So if you want a heavier, thicker fabric, then you'll want less of a particle distance. If you want more of a more pleats in here, as it were, then just lower the particle distance. It takes a bit longer to simulate, but compared to a lot of other cloth simulations, it's still really no time at all. I think this took sort of 5 minutes, so really is quite quick. Now I wanted to talk about one of these chairs here. So as you can see, this chair is just basically cloth, and if I move it, you'll see there's actually nothing underneath this one. So I created a basic quick chair proxy object for use as an avatar in Marvelous Designer, and I'm not going to go through the simple poly modeling on that, but I will show you what it looked like. And when I import more complicated avatars for Marvelous Designer, I like to do them outside of the scene I'm working on. So what I'll do is I'll create a new scene and then create the object that I want, and then I'll import the final cloth object into the actual scene I'm working with. This allows me to sort of keep my objects separate, so I can build up a library of drapery, curtains, bedspreads, chairs and things like that. It's just one of the ways that I like to keep my stuff organized. So I've got this chair, and my grid at the moment is set on meters, so this should be sort of a meter high-ish. It's about the right size for a large armchair. You don't have to be exact, you do have to get it in the ballpark though. Let's just export this. So we'll just export selection, and I'll call it chair for MD. As you can see, I've done this once already, and you'll notice that I didn't export this at the same time. Now there is some method in my madness which we'll go through later, but for right now let's just export these again as a group this time. So I've got one object like so and one object like so, and we're going to use this to exploit the way that Marvelous Designer imports its avatars, so we can actually use this to trap cloth underneath. So bear with me, all will become clear. So we have our slightly higher res curtains, which we've no need for, so I'm going to hit new garment, no, and that will disappear. We've still got this old curtain rail avatar in there, so again import obj, and we're just going to go chair for MD, and once again make sure we're on centimeters. Now even though I was modeling in meters there, I'm still importing into Marvelous Designer in centimeters for Maya. You might have to do some corrections on that for Max or Cinema 4D or whatever else you're using. So let's just create a quick polygon and make sure we're at the right size. So Marvelous Designer thinks this square is about 2 meters 60, which probably makes this chair about 1 meter 10 in height, which is approximately where I want it. So that's good enough. Now you'll notice that this chair isn't actually touching the floor, and if I go into Maya, it's not touching the floor. That's because I want the cloth to be able to go underneath the chair, and as we've seen in Marvelous Designer, anything under this line simply gets sort of chopped off by the program. So I floated it a little above the floor just for this exercise, and this time I'm not going to use a square, I'm going to use a circle. So just create a circle which will be about the right size. And remember, it's going to fall from the top and completely envelop the sides, so this one might be a little small. However, yeah, I think it will be a little small. However, we can test that out fairly easily. And let's just make sure our gizmo is set to local. I think it is, but it never hurts to check. Now, let's just get that and sort of get it into place. Now I'm not going to have this bisect the geometry, and neither should you. I'm just sort of putting it here so I can get a better look at when it's sort of square. And if I hit simulate now, after changing the particle distance up to 40, it's just going to fall on the chair. So you can see here our avatar working. It's colliding with the cloth quite nicely, but we're not actually anywhere near the floor at the moment, so as I said, our circle is simply not big enough. But that's okay, we just press this transform pattern. You can also use A on the keyboard, and we'll just make this slightly larger. I mean, the nice thing about this is it is quite fast to simulate, even when working with a large piece of cloth like this, so you don't have to get it exactly right the first time, which is a good job because that's a little too long, but already you can start to see that I'm getting that sort of look that I had, that we just saw a moment ago. Okay, that might be about the right length, but we need this to wrap under the bottom of the chair. So let's reset the pattern just to make sure that we got a sort of right length. Yeah, that looks about perfect to me. Make sure it's hitting the floor on all sides. And now, as we did when we drew in the internal lines, we made them elastic, so we can make this entire piece of fabric elastic. So we're using the basic fabric at the moment, so I'm going to go up here and add a new fabric. I'll just leave it called fabric 1. I'm going to set this to a preset, which I will set to, let's say, cotton, because this would be a heavy cotton fabric to cover the chair. And now I'll need to assign it to this fabric. So basically, if I click here, you'll see the fabric for this pattern is basic fabric. I can now set it to fabric 1, which we have here, which we have set to the cotton preset. So once again, now this falls more like a heavier cotton material. So now we've simulated this far, we want to wrap it under the bottom of the actual chair. Now, in order to do that, we need to tell it it's elastic. So we're going to take elastic on. And again, you've just got these strength and ratios. So let's up the strength a bit. Let's lower the ratio. 65 should do it and simulate, and you should start to see this gather underneath the chair. Okay, obviously that ratio is not low enough, not by half, so let's try knocking that down considerably. And there we go, it starts to bunch up under the chair. Okay, and we're going to want some more strength on there as well. And a smaller ratio. The reason why I can't give you an exact ratio is the exact ratio you're going to need depends on how much extra fabric you've had trailing around on the floor. But what we'll actually do is we'll get this to this kind of point. So it's just sort of nicely bunched up under there. And then when we start stretching this fabric around later to get our chair shape back, we'll adjust that elasticity. But for right now, this seems fine. Now, excuse me. Now we want our basic chair shape, which we do not have at the moment. Now there's a couple of ways you can do this. Like I've said, with Marvelous Designer, you can actually kind of pull the fabric around in real time. So we could try pulling this fabric down, but it's just going to spring back up, and unless you've got some sort of supercomputer, you're not actually going to be able to do this in real time. So there is another way to do it, and one of the reasons I picked this chair was because I wanted to give you a look at the pinning system in Marvelous Designer. So if we go up here, you'll see multiple pinning and multiple selection. So what I want to do is just click multiple pinning, and you'll see I get a sort of drag and drop tool where I can start putting pins in. If I simulate now, this fabric will stay in the same place. So if I grab these pins and push them down, the fabric will actually come with them. This will allow me to pull this down and eventually pin this to the bottom of the avatar. However, let's just remove these pins for now. And let's simulate that back to a sort of flat state, because what I did was when I hit the pin, I wanted to use the lasso pinning tool. So I want to kind of get this, and again it's one of those things that I take some more time with normally, but I want to kind of speed up a little bit for the sake of the tutorial, and I'm going to pull this down and just simulate. I'm going to watch the whole thing sort of drop down. So once again, push it down. Okay, and once it's down far enough, okay, that's down far enough, and you'll notice I didn't do it all in one big jump, because sometimes if you make too much of a large change with Marvelous Designer, your fabric can sort of explode and your simulation will go horrendously wrong. So I prefer to, whenever I'm using this kind of pinning method to give me a fabric look, I prefer to do a little bit, simulate, stop, and then do a little bit more, rather than trying to get it all done in one giant pass. So what I can do now is click attach to avatar, and it will actually attach these pins to this chair. The reason I didn't do that when the fabric was at the top of the chair is because if you do that, it will attach them to the nearest surface of the avatar, so you can end up with fabric in places you don't want it. Okay, so now you can see that my fabric has been attached there to the chair. So now we simulate. Okay, so now I've got my chair look. You can see our fabric appears a little broken here. Now when we up the resolution of this fabric, that will change. So I'm going to look at this pinning a little bit, because I think I've pinned it in too many places. So what I'm going to do is just remove the pins, and I'm going to have another lasso pin, and I'm going to attach those to avatar and simulate again. And this has just kicked some of this top fabric back up, and again that depends on the look you're going for. Maybe you want it completely flat there. I wanted mine up a little bit. So I mean, this is how easy it is to start creating cloth for archviz with Marvelous Designer. We've gone from a really simple chair object to something that'll look quite nice when we get it in our 3D package in a couple of minutes. I mean, really, for this thing, the simulation is really fast compared to something like Encloth, and it's been set to do exactly what we're doing with it. So there's our basic chair. However, it's not very exciting along the back and sides. So if we hit simulate, we should be able to now, with those pins in, keeping everything in place, just start pulling it a little bit, create some more interesting kind of folds. And I can see my machine is really struggling with doing this in real time. So once again, you can use a pinning method. So grab some of these, click back to the move tool, and lift them up. So you don't want to do too much at once and out. So I can now use this to sort of create some interesting folds. Apologies, wrong key there. To create some interesting folds in my fabric, and if my machine, which in this case it is too slow to do it in real time, I can just stop the simulation and move it again. And you'll see that this creates some more interesting folds along the side for us. So now I've pulled this fabric really quite far forward, and we can see this changes the look at the front. So you can go around and pin and pull just to create different looks. I'm just going to stop that simulation now. And you always want to remove the pins, because obviously if you got this back into Maya, this is going to look awfully strange. So going to re-simulate that, and then just let it settle from where the pins are in it. And now one of the last things I like to do is just create myself a little more resolution in this. But before I do that, I'm going to use one of these multi-pins again. And I just want to select these bits of fabric here. And some here. And some here. Because I'm just going to pull the cloth on the arms up a little bit before I increase the resolution or decrease the particle density and simulate again. Okay, so that's just lifted those up a little bit. And the tearing that you see here is not actually going to be that torn once you get it back into Maya. It's more of a Marvelous Designer viewport thing. So let's just click on our fabric and our resolution, which is 40. Let's lower that down to 20. And now let's hit simulate. Okay, so my top pins pull the fabric up a little bit. And if you notice any trouble spots, like I say, this is not going to be bad at all in Maya, but just for the sake of doing things the right way. And then of course I'll remove all of these pins and let the fabric naturally drape back down onto the chair. Just give this a second to sim out. But I wanted to show you again the chair because it creates some of this pinning method which we didn't see with the curtains. We used more elastic internal lines to do the shape of the cloth, and now we're using an avatar and pins, so it's just a different way of working with Marvelous Designer. So I'm going to actually remove all these pins. And it can be a bit of a pain. Okay, so we're on a resolution that I like. That's good. And what else I wanted to do, when I told you earlier there would be some method in my madness, was just let me sim this out. And the reason I created two avatars, one that was one chair and one chair with a cushion on top, will become apparent in a second. Just let this sim for a sec. Okay, and as I said, this tearing that you see here in the Marvelous Designer viewport, it won't appear like this in Maya. This is more of a viewport problem. The fabric is bisecting the avatar by maybe a millimeter or two. If we were to go to a higher resolution, you wouldn't see this in the viewport, and when we get it into Maya, you just simply won't notice it's there. So it won't look torn or anything, so don't panic about that. Now I've got the one avatar in there. If I put the other avatar in there that I created, that will actually have the cushion object on top. So if I just go import OBJ and go chair for Marvelous Designer with top, make sure it's in centimeters, my current avatar has been replaced with this one, which actually has the cushion object on it. So what should happen now is when I resimulate, Marvelous Designer will actually take this cushion into account. So I should be able to just remove these pins if I can get to them. Nope. As I said, this can be a bit painful sometimes. Remove pin. And before I do this, because I have some bisections, I just want to save this garment. So I just call that chair. And then I'm going to resimulate. And you can see that it's now interacting with the top of the avatar, so I'm getting the cloth more pushed down, more into shape. So the basic pinning allowed us to get it into shape enough to put this sort of cushion proxy. not sure what else to call it, onto the top, and that's allowed us to exploit the way that Marvelous Designer actually imports its avatars. So you can do these multi-layered avatars to help you with fabric placement and stuff. Now we've obviously got a stuck bit of cloth here, which happens sometimes because the pinning's not perfect, but it's not that big of an issue because I can use, of course, the pinning tool and then back to the movement tool, and I can use that to sort of move that out of the way of this avatar so it's no longer kind of intersecting with it. Great, and then as soon as that's pulled out of the way, I can just remove the pins. It's a Marvelous Designer, as we discussed already, will do this in real time by you just pushing and sort of pulling it about. But I've found that pinning and pulling the pins and then doing the resimulation is a lot more reliable method that gives you a lot more control than just trying to sort of pull willy-nilly at the fabric as the simulation is in progress, because I mean it does sim pretty quick, but as you can see from the viewport here, it's not exactly uber responsive at the moment. So I prefer to pause sim, pin, and then move from there. Okay, so there's our basic chair done, and of course we can adjust this elasticity at the bottom to get these pleats tighter. We could increase the resolution, we could do a lot of things with this, but before we go any further, what I want to do is sim out a couple of cushions. So the way I do these cushions can be used for chair cushions, bed pillows, anything like that. So now we've got the basics of our chairs. We'll come back in the next lesson and take a look at putting some actual cushions on it instead of this sort of very low res, very boring cushion proxy. Okay, so I'll be back in the next part. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Okay, welcome back. In the last part we left off here. I've allowed my chair to sim out for a couple of minutes just to make sure all the fabric is settled down, and I'm pretty happy with the look. I mean, it could be a bit more detailed back here, but I'm going to cover it up with cushions. But if you want to create some extra folds in the back, you can just use the pin and pull around method that we discussed earlier. So first things first, let's just save this out. So I'm going to save it as a garment, and I've already saved it once, but better to be safe than sorry. And now I'm going to export it for Maya. So I'm just going to export as OBJ, chair for Maya. She'll save over my old one, and it's going to be a single object this time because there is only one pattern that makes up the whole cloth covering. And once again, make sure we have centimeters ticked and just click OK. So we've now exported that out. Going to pop open our copy of Maya, and you can see this proxy object that we used. So I'm going to import the object we just generated with Marvelous Designer, chair for Maya, and you should see it fits straight over that proxy object, which if we just move this, you can see that it's a perfect match. You can also see that the tearing that was happening in Marvelous Designer is simply not happening here. So once again, if you think this little rough maybe, although for me it's perfectly fine, it looks a little jagged in the viewport, but once it's rendered it will look perfect. It's just no anti-aliasing in this viewport, so it looks a little jagged. But if you want more smoothness, you can always come in with the Sculpt Poly tool, Sculpt Geometry tool, and kind of get that to a reasonable size, use the smooth, and come in and do a little bit of smoothing if you feel like you need to. Okay, but for me this is good to go, so I'm actually going to undo those changes. But just be aware you might need to do some smoothing tweaks once it's out of Marvelous Designer. I recommend you wait until you've got some good rendered shots of it though. Okay, now if we look at the poly count on this, you know, we're looking at maybe 120,000 polys, which is not so much for cloth, but I want to use this as a avatar object in Marvelous Designer, because when I put the cushions on it, obviously I want them to correspond to exactly where this cloth is, and if I have sort of a cushion hanging over the edge, I'll need to use this now as my proxy, not this. So let's just hide that for a start. So just Control H there, and I'm just going to set this back to its point of origin. There we go. So in order to get this to a correct number of polys, I'm just going to use a tool in Maya which will kind of reduce the poly count of the mesh. So I'm just going to go to Mesh Reduce. I'm going to pop open its option box. Okay, it will keep the original just in case something goes wrong. We're going to reduce it by a percentage of 50, and this should be perfect for what we need. So this can take a little while depending on the number of polys you've got. Okay, and there is our reduced mesh. Maybe it doesn't have material on it, so we'll bung a lambert on it, and you can see that it's been greatly reduced. Now obviously you wouldn't use this for a render, but as a proxy object it's absolutely fine. We don't need so much detail, and in fact I might actually reduce that a little more. So let's just go to Mesh Reduce again, and this time we won't bother to keep the original, and we'll reduce it by a further 50%. There we go. So once again you can see the difference between the two. This is obviously much lower poly, and you wouldn't, as I said, want to use it for a render, but as an object to use in Marvelous Designer or something like RealFlow or any kind of program you might be exporting out, Mesh Reduce is a nice quick simple way of just creating that proxy object. So I'm going to re-export this back out. Cloth, chair, Marvelous Designer, and into Marvelous Designer now. We've saved this garment so we don't need it anymore, so let's hit New Garment, and we're going to load in the new avatar. So import OBJ, and here we have chair for MD. Where is it? Cloth chair MD, centimeters again. Okay, and there's our chair proxy object we can now use in Marvelous Designer. So when we drop the cushions on it, it will conform to this exact shape, as opposed to just being a decent guess with our old proxy object. So I'm going to use, say, a circular cushion, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to have an inside of the cushion and an outside of the cushion. So I'm going to actually stitch this together in 4 parts, and it's easier if I just simply do it, and then we'll talk about what's happening. So I want 2 circles. I'm going to need 4 in the end, but for right now 2, and I want one to be slightly larger than the other, because the inner one will be the actual cushion, so the padding if you like, and the outer one will be the cushion cover. So let's just A on the keyboard or up there. Okay, you don't have to be perfect with this, and I'm going to copy and paste. And once again I'm going to copy and paste. And remember, with Marvelous Designer it's really not so important with this kind of stuff where these are in this viewport. Let's just sync those across, and you'll see what I've got is the 4 circles. So this might make a bit more sense when I do this. In fact, let's just bring all of these up out the way of intersection with that chair. So I'm going to stitch these 2 smaller circles together, and then I'm going to stitch these larger circles together. The larger circles will envelop the smaller circles, the larger circles will become the cushion cover, and the smaller circles will become the cushion filling. So if I take this smaller circle and we go to our sewing, and I'm going to have to stitch like so, and you can see now that that is not so good. So the easiest way is to just see where we're going. Okay, as you can see, that's just not going to work, so let's find out where we need to put these seam lines. And this can be a bit of a pain. It appears that this one is the wrong way around, so let's just flip it. Okay, now as you can see, those two seam lines are together, which hopefully should mean that these two are together. Okay, I've got a seam overlap. Now I need to delete this seam, but I can't, so let's turn it off. Can I delete it now? No, I said that's a little bug in Marvelous Designer. Let's just try that again. Okay, what I'm going to have to do is just to save the garment. I'll save it as cushion, and then I'll simply reopen it. Now you shouldn't have to do that. There you go, now I can delete it. As I said, it's a very annoying bug in Marvelous Designer. I'm not sure if it's just with my copy, but if you experience that problem, you might want to try that trick. So now we have that seam line attached, as you can see here in the viewport. So let's see which ones need attaching now. Oops, that's it sync, so we're syncing back across. There we go. Okay, so if I was to simulate this now, this would close together and become one cushion shaped object, as you can see. Let's just reset the patterns. So let's stitch these two together. Okay, and we've got that same problem, which is not really anything to worry about. We'll just rotate this one like so. Okay, and now we can see our seam line there. So now it's just a case of connecting these. This one to this one, and this one to this one. So there we go. This will become the actual basis for our cushion, and we just want to make sure that our smaller cushion parts here are inside our larger ones. So now you should be able to, get a real idea of what's going to happen. This is all going to close up together. The outer ones will be the covers and the inner ones will be the stuffing. So I'm just going to go back to here and select them all, so I can just do a universal rotate with all of them. And then I can move this to approximately where I want it on the chair. As you've probably already discovered yourself by now, this Marvelous Designer, this interface part is not the best I've ever used, but as we said before, it gets the job done. So now let's simulate this. And as you can see, this all closes up to make a nice cushion. But as you can also see, it's fallen completely flat. So that was looking great there until it fell down and completely compressed into this just sort of looks like a fabric bag as opposed to a cushion. And that's because we need to set a new fabric for our inside cushions. Okay, so the problem, as you've seen, is the fact that this just falls flat as a pancake. So what we need to do is edit these materials. Now, if I take a look at the fabric up here, we've just got one basic fabric. So let's add a fabric and just call this inner. Let's see here. There we go. So we'll call this inner, and what I want to do is make this sort of a poofy material like you'd find as a cushion filling, for instance. So quite an easy way to do this, and you've got some presets. None of these are going to be great for us, but you know, they are there, and if you want to give them a try out. But for this, I'm just going to make my own. So I'm going to put the stretch weft up to 90, stretch wrap, bending, and bend wrap. And if you watch what happens now, you'll see this doesn't just deflate, it now contains what's going to act as our padding. Okay, well, that had exactly the same problem as the last one, and that's because if we look in our big circles, the fabric is basic fabric, and if we look in our small circles, the fabric is also basic fabric. So we need to select these small circles and assign the correct fabric to them. And now you'll see it won't just fall as flat as a pancake. Okay, so you can see it retains the cushion shape, and you'll also hopefully now see, if I can just stop that, why I used two different types of material and two different types of filling. Because the inner filling is all poofy, if we didn't have this outer cushion cover, we just have no detail around these edges at all, so we wouldn't have these nice, you know, folds here. So this looks actually a lot more cushion-like, because it looks like you would have your cushions at home, you know, a cushion cover plus cushion filling. So there is one last thing we want to do to this. We want to make sure these edge seams actually look like a seam, and that's not so difficult to do. We just basically come up to the seam, we take all of our seam lines here, and we set the fold angle to 360. Now, if you remember earlier in the tutorial I did that, it gave us a much more pronounced fold. That's kind of what we're looking for here. So while I'm at that, I'll actually take these two outer discs, which will be our cushion covers, and I'll set the particle distance. Actually, it's already set at 20, so should be high enough resolution for what I'm looking for. Okay, and that's just finishing its simulation. So that's actually slowly collapsing in on itself. Okay, let me make sure we set these seam lines right. Because that shouldn't have really had that much of an effect on this, and I think it's because we've grabbed way too many seam lines. What we need is the inner seam lines, not the outer ones, so let's find out where those are. So we can do that by just resetting the pattern. Okay, so these are the outer seam lines, so we just need those really. And we'll leave the inner seam lines where they are. And now that should behave more as we want it. Okay, so now it's not collapsing in on itself, and we've got a more pronounced fold around the outside here, much more as you would expect to see on a cushion cover. And by building it in two parts, we've got this really nice feeling of having a fat cushion but with a loose cover on it. And because we've used our decimated mesh, our low poly mesh, as our proxy object, when I take this now and export it, so OBJ, and I'll just call this chair cush. Okay, so in this case I'm going to export it as a single object, because I'm never going to want to texture the inside of it separately, so as you're never going to see it, I might as well keep it as a single object. Remember to hit centimeter, and now if we pull it into Maya, so chair cushion, there we go, it's going to fit perfectly on our full size object. So you could take some time and obviously put it in a different place, add 2 cushions, 3, 4, however many you wanted. But that's basically one cloth chair with cushion completely done in Marvelous Designer. So I'll be back for the next part and we're going to talk about another very common aspect of visualization, which will be beds, bedspreads and that sort of thing. Okay, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next part. Hi, welcome back. In the last part we left off after having designed our cushion, and as I said, this technique can be used to make the cushions for the bed or any other sort of pillow or cushion you might want to make. So we took that into Maya and you can see our version here. I also have a couple of versions that I've previously done. So as you can see, they're pretty much exactly the same. I've just used a couple more cushions and I've got one with more of a flat front. So that was basically how the chairs were done. We've also done the curtains, as you can see here. And now I want to work on a bedspread. So for me that means a couple of different components. A duvet, some sort of padded blanket, a fitted sheet around the bottom, and maybe a messy top sheet. So first things first, let's get this model out here to Marvelous Designer to make the fitted sheet. So let's just export this selection and I'll call this Mattress for Marvelous Designer, and once again we'll just new garment and we'll import a new avatar for Marvelous Designer and mat for MD. Okay, centimeters, should know the drill by now, and there we go. So this will be our base object for our fitted sheet. So just a rectangle. And I'm just going to guesstimate the size here, and then when we pull it over to this view we can do any tweaks that might be needed. Okay, so hit the synchronize button and we'll see what sort of size we need to get this. Okay, and I'm actually going to bisect this with the bed for now, just because it helps get a proper size. Okay, so the sides look like they should be fine, but we need a little more length. Okay, and you'll find the fitted sheet is really easy to make. So we're just kind of getting it to the size where it will wrap around the sides when we need it to. And I'm going to use a particle distance of 40 just to make this simulation a bit quicker. And I can see that this edge is not quite long enough. It's not going to have enough fabric to wrap under. So I'll just reset that and you'll see once again it's done that annoying thing where it jumps about. So once again we'll have to get it into position. Now I don't know why, but Marvelous Designer does have that tendency to do that the first time you reset a fabric, or a pattern as they call it. So we'll just make this a tad longer on either end, and that should be about good to go. So let's simulate that out once more. Okay, and that should be around perfect. So now you see I reset the pattern and it appears where it should. So let's set the particle distance on this to 20. And it's important, because we're going to wrap this under the bed, it actually is important to do this simulation first, or what will happen is if we make this bottom edge elastic, it'll try and wrap round before it's had chance to drop. So you have to do this in 2 parts. So I'm going to select the pattern, and you'll see it's got a setting for elastic, so let's just make its ratio a little smaller, maybe down to 40, and its strength up, and simulate again, and you'll see it attempts to wrap around the bottom of the bed. And actually that's pretty successful just on the first try. So you get this fitted sheet. Now you can decrease the particle density to increase the resolution. so you'll get less folds or tighter folds, but I quite like this. You know, if you've got the model in Maya, it lets people know that there's a sheet on the bed. So this is actually good to go for me. I'll just let it simulate out and settle down for a couple of seconds. Okay, and maybe increase the ratio a bit. So there we go. I'm going to try ratio 60 to loosen up the sheet a little bit. There we go. And you can play around with this and get it right for the sort of scene you want. But for me, this is good. So I'm going to export this now as an OBJ, and I think I have one already. Yep. So once again, I don't need the avatar shape, and I need to make sure I'm going out in centimeters. Everything else looks fine. Okay, so back into Maya, and I'm going to re-import the sheet, because when it comes to doing the duvet, which we'll do in a second, I'm going to want that sheet as a avatar in Marvelous Designer. So let's just import this. Okay, and as you can see, that fits our scene very well. Now you can see we've got some tearing here. If we actually just move the mattress, you'll see that you can't notice this once the actual mattress shape is out of the way. If you do want to leave your mattress shape in there, you can just go to the Sculpt Poly tool or Sculpt Geometry tool, and we can use the pull out function and just sort of pull this out a little bit. So, you know, just take your time and come in, and you may have to do some final tweaks after the fact. You can then of course use the smooth tool to smooth it up a little bit. For me personally, I'm not going to need to do that because I'm not going to use this underneath mattress anymore. What I am going to do, however, is reduce the poly count of this sheet so it's better for use as an avatar in Marvelous Designer. Basically for the same reason we reduced the poly count on one of our chairs. So let's just now go to Mesh Reduce, and I'll just reduce this. The default is 50%. I'm going to reduce by 75%. I won't need to keep the original in this instance, and I'm just going to hit reduce. This could take a couple of minutes or not, depending on your machine. And now I've got our sheet there in a vastly reduced polygon form. So you'll notice I just deleted the under mattress because I'm really not going to use it anymore. So now I need to get the mattress and the bed frame out together, because the duvet will actually interact with the bed frame, of course. So let's just select the geometry on my bed frame here and select our decimated mesh sheet, and I'm just going to join those together, mesh combine, and now I'll export this as one object for Marvelous Designer. So bed frame. Now we can go back to MD, new garment, and new avatar. So again, just make sure your scale is correct. And now I have the bed, mattress and bed frame to work on positioning my duvet. You'll notice that my bed frame intersects the floor plane here. That's fine for me because I actually wanted it lower than it was originally modelled. So I don't mind if my duvet hits the floor before my legs, because in my scene my legs are actually bisecting the floor. So let's just make another polygonal sheet here. And this one will come down a bit to how you want your scene to look, because I'm going to have my duvet drape on the floor. You might not want yours, you might want yours to finish higher up, that's fine. And hit sync, and there we go. Let's just get one of these into position. And let's bisect it with the bed again. It's just easier to line up. just going to make this bottom a little longer. There we go. Okay, before we go into make the duvet, I just want to show you one really quick technique you can use for making a messy bed sheet, and it really is very simple. So we're just going to turn this particle distance to 40 and hit simulate on this sheet. Now I might actually change the material of my sheet, so I might go in and make the basic fabric here into, say, a satin for our satin bed sheet. And now with it still simulating, I can actually pick up, as I've said before, grab this. So if I wanted a kind of folded over corner here, so I can now use this to really create the sort of messy bed sheet look that I might want. Now you will find this technique really helpful for cloth design, very interactive, very fast. One of the real benefits of using Marvelous Designer. So you can see I can start to pull this bed sheet around here, and I can create my wrinkles and whatnot and get a really quite realistic looking messy bit of kit. Okay, so just pull in any extra wrinkles you might want. Now I'm doing this very quickly, but you can take your time with this and get the exact look of bedsheet that you want. I can then, of course, drop the particle size down to 20, let that simulate out for a minute, and this will just smooth all these wrinkles. Okay, so that's a really simple way, and then of course you come in and put your cushions up here at the head of the bed. But that's a really, really simple way to create this style of, you know, messy top sheet. So let's just save that. And I think I have a version I've already done here. Yeah. So, easy way to create a messy folded back top sheet. Just thought I'd cover that for you guys before we went any further. But now we want a duvet. The duvet is going to be slightly more complicated. I did Google around, and you can see on a duvet that it has these folded pleats in it. So if we just look at the Google image search I did rather quickly, you can see that, you know, most duvets have these kind of either square pattern or diamond pattern or just straight lines. So we need to replicate this heavy sort of puffy look that you get with the duvet, and we also want to put some sort of pattern on it. So what we need to achieve this is not one sheet but two. So I'm just going to copy and paste this, Control C and V, and now I'm going to move it into place. So once again, as we did with the cushions, I'm going to stitch these two pieces of cloth together, and this one I'm going to flip, because as we saw before, actually the top one I'm going to leave as the top one, and the bottom one I'm going to flip. And as you can see, Marvelous Designer throwing its normal viewpoint manipulation problems up at us. It can be a little frustrating to work with, but you don't have to be precise, thankfully. We just want to get it into sort of basically the right way. There we go. Now I'll select both and move them into position on the bed. Okay, again let's bisect just to make sure we're all hunky-dory. Now I'm going to line my duvet up quite square as well, but you can obviously go ahead and go for a more messy look if that's what your scene calls for. Okay, so let's stitch this together, and I just need to select one. So let's begin our stitching. So this one to this one, let's see what we get. Okay, that's perfect, which will mean it should be this one to this one. Yes, and then this one to this one, and we've crossed them over, so that's no good. Control Z. There we go. So now it's all stitched together. You should know by now, if we simply simulate this, what will happen is they'll just close up together and become one piece of fabric. But it won't look like a duvet. You know, it doesn't have that heft to it. A proper duvet sticks out more, you know, it's full of filling. Now, we could design the duvet in the same way that we design the cushions, but because it's such a big piece of fabric, I find this way, then it becomes very difficult to manipulate it, because we'd have 4 large pieces of fabric if we designed this with an actual inner filling. And we've already done that, so I'd like to show you a different way of doing it. So let's reset the pattern, and once again, thank you, marvelous designer. Okay, that should be fine. It's not perfect, but it doesn't matter, as these seams will close up the gap for me anyway. So what we need to do is some way of putting some padding inside this, and we can actually select both of these and do it with the pressure attribute. So if I use, say, a negative pressure of 100, this is going to inflate like a balloon, but just for demonstration purposes, you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, that's not going to inflate like a balloon. Maybe I need, in this instance, a positive pressure. Okay, so let's reset that and use a positive pressure of 100. There we go. So you can see I can use this pressure attribute to fill up the inside of the cloth, a bit like designing a interior padding mechanism. So let's try a more realistic interior pressure of, say, 10. And you can see this now behaves much more like a duvet. It's still way too buoyant. Kind of, that'd be a little too much padding for your duvet, I'm thinking. So let's pump that down to 5 and see where we get. It's looking a little better. So you can see it still looks like a padded duvet. Maybe we go a little bit higher on that pressure. Depends how much filling or how much illusion of filling that you need. So let's try 7. And there we go, you can see the edges start to lift up. And these outer edges are now sort of pushed out, as you would expect on a duvet. But again, that's filling up too much, so I'm going to leave that at 5. Also, that will sort of calm down when we increase the particle density. Now, as I don't want too much of it up near the head of the bed, and I want more of the foot of the bed to drape, I'm just going to move it like so. And then I'm going to simulate it again. So we've got the properties of our duvet pretty much down now with this pressure attribute. What we need to do is put those lines on it. You know, as we saw on Google, all of these duvets pretty much have some sort of stitching to keep the filling in place, but also, you know, it does make for a more attractive looking piece of bedspread. So let's do that. So a couple of ways to do this, the simplest of which is one of them we've already used, but we've used it in the past to do elastic. Now I'm going to use it simply to create folds in the fabric. So select this internal polygonal line, and you're going to want to measure this out. I'm just going to do it by eye, so Control C and Control V, and then just keep Control V. And as I said, please take a bit more time than I am with this, because I'm just sort of whapping these on. Okay, and you're going to want to do that to the top part of the duvet. So if we simulate again, you'll see not a lot's happened, because we'll need to make these stronger, but you might see some small creases start to appear. There we go. So you can see we've got these small creases starting to appear now. But they're the wrong way round. So what's happening is they're pinching upwards, whereas if we look at our duvet pictures, they're most definitely recessed, so we need to fix that. So let's grab all of our shape 2Ds, which are these internal polygonal lines, and let's just go ahead and turn the fold angle from 180 to 0, and the fold strength maybe up to, let's put it very high, just to exaggerate this. Okay, so now when I hit simulate, you should start to see that these are still pushing out the wrong way. So if you find this happen to you, that these are out the wrong way, it just means you need to invert your fold angle from 0 to 360, and then they should face inwards. There we go. Perfect. Now that will depend on which way round you flipped your sheet. So you might need a fold angle of 0, or you might need a fold angle of 360. It's actually quite difficult to say, because that will depend on whether it's the top or the bottom of the sheet. So when we flipped the sheet at the beginning, that's why. Normally I would have flipped it the other way, at which point this fold line would have become 360, not 0. But it's not a complicated thing to kind of work out. So okay, and now I've got a very duvet looking piece of cloth. Now of course, if you want to mess around with this a bit, you can still grab it and sort of make it a more messy duvet. So if I want to fold over, for instance, 1/2 of this, it's not a problem. You'll see that I don't have the folds on the back, because I didn't put the internal polygonal lines on the back sheet. Now you can actually go ahead and just do that. That will fix that particular issue for you. But I actually quite like the fact that the back and front look a little different. So let's just create some sort of hard creases in our duvet. And you don't have to do this, you can leave yours in a kind of pristine condition if you'd like. I just, for the sake of the render, I always think it's nice when it's a little messy. Okay, and that's given me these little pleats here. So I'm going to go ahead now, turn the particle distance to 20, and just resim this out. And you'll see my folds get much more pronounced. Now if that's maybe too pronounced for you, you can come in here and change the fold strength. So maybe turn that down to 50, and you'll see these get a little less pronounced over time. Okay, maybe you need to turn it down lower. I actually quite like them as they are. And there is one duvet. Now I should have made it a bit longer on the sides, maybe. You know, maybe even a bit longer on the front. Again, it will depend entirely on what sort of render you're after. So let's just export this for Maya. So we will call it, I think I've got one here already. I'll just call it top sheet. Centimeters. Don't want the avatar to come with it. single object is absolutely fine in this case, and let's go. Okay, so back into Maya, and there we have our fitted sheet. So let's import our duvet, and there's our duvet. So that pretty much covers everything I wanted to do for this series. We've got some duvet, and you're going to need to center the pivot on that probably. So we created this duvet, we created this bottom fitted sheet, we've created a messy top sheet as well as the duvet, we created these chairs, I showed you how to create cushions. You should now be able to create pretty much any style of curtains that you want, so we covered quite a lot. So thank you very much for watching this. I'm Dave from SimplyMaya. You can find me over there in the forums. If you have any questions, just give me a shout. Thanks.